I watched my family enjoy Christmas dinner while I sat outside in the cold. I fed a shivering dog my only sandwich. Then I saw it. A diamond on his collar. I dialed the number on his collar. Out of nowhere, a black Mercedes arrived. The butler revealed the dog belonged to a disabled billionaire I nursed years ago. When he saw me, he did something that changed my Christmas night and my life. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from, so I can see how far my story has reached. My name is Flora, and at 68 years old, I thought I had learned to expect very little from my family. But nothing could have prepared me for Christmas Eve, 2024, when my own son made it clear that I wasn't welcome at my grandson's first Christmas dinner. The phone call came 3 days earlier. "Mom, about Christmas dinner," Trent said, his voice carrying that particular tone I'd grown to recognize over the years, the one he used when he was about to deliver news I wouldn't like. "Miranda and I have been talking, and we think it would be better if you didn't come this year." I stood in my small kitchen, gripping the phone so tightly my knuckles went white. "I don't understand. It's Christmas. It's little Tommy's first Christmas." "I know, Mom, but Miranda's parents are flying in from Connecticut, and her sister and brother-in-law are coming too. The dining room only seats 8 people comfortably and with the baby's high chair." He let the sentence hang there, as if the mathematics of it all made perfect sense. "I could sit in the living room," I offered, hating how small my voice sounded. "I don't need to be at the main table." There was a pause, and I could hear Miranda's voice in the background, sharp and insistent, though I couldn't make out the words. "Mom, look, it's just complicated this year. Maybe we can get together the day after Christmas, just the 4 of us." The 4 of us. As if I were some distant relative instead of his mother. As if I hadn't spent every Christmas for the past 37 years making sure he had everything he wanted under the tree. Even when money was so tight I had to choose between groceries and electricity. "Of course," I heard myself saying. "I understand." But I didn't understand. Not really. On Christmas Eve morning, I woke up to silence. No excited phone calls about last-minute preparations. No requests to bring my famous sweet potato casserole that Trent used to beg for every year. Just silence. I dressed carefully in my best navy blue dress, the one I'd worn to Trent's wedding 5 years ago. It was a little loose now. I'd lost weight since my retirement forced me to stretch my pension of $950 a month further than it wanted to go. But it was still respectable, still dignified. I wasn't going to spend Christmas alone in my apartment, staring at the small artificial tree I'd decorated with ornaments Tommy would never see. I couldn't bear that. So I decided to drive to Trent's neighborhood, just to see the house lit up for Christmas. Just to feel connected somehow. The drive to Maplewood Estates took 20 minutes through streets lined with houses that glowed like jewels in the December darkness. Every window seemed to frame a perfect family scene: children in pajamas, parents laughing, grandparents holding babies. The American dream, wrapped up in holiday lights and mortgage payments that cost more than my entire annual income. Trent's house sat on Elm Street, a colonial revival that he and Miranda had bought 3 years ago for $280,000. I remembered when they'd shown me the house, how proud Trent had been of the granite countertops and the master bathroom with its enormous soaking tub. I'd congratulated him, even though I privately wondered how they'd managed the down payment on his sales job salary. I parked across the street, turned off my engine, and just watched. Through the dining room window, I could see them all gathered around the mahogany table that Miranda's mother had given them as a housewarming gift. Miranda, elegant in a red silk blouse, was holding Tommy while her father carved what looked like a perfectly golden turkey. Trent sat at the head of the table, laughing at something Miranda's brother had said. Her mother was refilling wine glasses from a bottle that probably cost more than I spent on groceries in a week. They looked like a magazine advertisement for perfect family Christmas. Everyone beautiful, everyone belonging, everyone wanted. And then I saw the empty chair at the foot of the table. A 9th chair, pushed slightly back as if someone had just stepped away. For one wild moment, I wondered if they'd set a place for me after all, if Trent was about to call and invite me in. But then Miranda's sister sat down in that chair, and I realized it had never been meant for me at all. I don't know how long I sat there, watching through that golden window. Long enough for my hands to go numb from the cold, even with the heat running. Long enough to see them bring out what looked like homemade pie, something that definitely wasn't store-bought like the desserts I usually contributed to family gatherings. Finally, I couldn't stand it anymore. I got out of my car, telling myself I was just going to walk around the block to get some fresh air before driving home. The sidewalks were clear, but patches of ice caught the streetlight, making everything look fragile and slippery. As I walked past Trent's house, I could hear laughter spilling out into the night. Warm, genuine laughter. The kind I remembered from when Trent was small and it was just the two of us, before he learned to be embarrassed by our tiny apartment and my secondhand clothes. I made it 3 blocks before I had to stop. Not because I was tired, but because my chest felt so tight I couldn't breathe properly. I sat down on a bench in the small neighborhood park, closed my eyes, and tried to remember when things had changed between us. When had I become someone my son was ashamed of? When had my love become something he tolerated rather than treasured? The wind picked up, cutting right through my wool coat. I should have gone home then. Should have driven back to my apartment and heated up the can of soup I'd planned for dinner. Should have watched some old Christmas movie and gone to bed early. Instead, I just sat there, feeling more alone than I ever had in my life. That's when I heard the whimpering. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then I heard it again. A soft, desperate sound coming from underneath the park bench beside mine. I leaned over and saw him. A small dog, maybe 20 pounds, with golden fur matted with snow and ice. He was shivering so violently his whole body shook. "Oh, honey," I whispered, getting down on my knees on the frozen ground. "What are you doing out here all alone?" The dog looked up at me with dark brown eyes that seemed to hold all the sadness in the world. He was wearing a collar, but no leash. Someone's pet, lost or abandoned on Christmas Eve. I reached into my purse and pulled out the ham sandwich I'd packed earlier, thinking I might need something to eat if I decided to drive around looking at Christmas lights. It was a small sandwich, 3 slices of grocery store ham on white bread with a little mustard. Nothing fancy, but it was all I had. "Are you hungry, sweetheart?" I asked, unwrapping the sandwich and breaking off a piece of ham. The dog's tail gave a tentative wag, and he crept closer to me. When I held out the ham, he took it gently from my fingers, barely using his teeth. Such good manners, despite being so obviously hungry. I fed him the entire sandwich piece by piece, talking to him softly the whole time. "There you go. That's better, isn't it? Such a good boy. Someone must be missing you terribly." As I gave him the last piece of bread, I noticed his collar more clearly. It wasn't just any collar. It was made of what looked like expensive leather, with small metal studs that caught the streetlight. And hanging from it was something that made me blink twice to make sure I was seeing correctly. A diamond. Not a rhinestone or a piece of glass, but what looked like a genuine diamond, about the size of a dime, hanging from a small platinum setting. I looked around the empty park, suddenly feeling like I was in some kind of fairy tale. Who put a diamond on a dog's collar? And what was a dog wearing something so valuable doing lost in a suburban park on Christmas Eve? The dog finished eating and settled down next to me on the bench, his warm body pressed against my side. For the first time all day, I felt like someone actually wanted my company. "What's your story, honey?" I asked, gently stroking his damp fur. "And what are we going to do with you?" As if in answer, he lifted his head and looked at me with those soulful brown eyes. And for the first time since Trent's phone call 3 days ago, I felt something other than rejection and sadness. I felt needed. The diamond caught the streetlight again, winking like a star. I looked closer at the collar and noticed something I'd missed before. a small metal tag tucked behind the diamond. A phone number was engraved on it in tiny, precise letters. My hands were shaking as I pulled out my phone, though I wasn't sure if it was from the cold or from something else entirely. Something that felt like hope, even though I couldn't explain why. The dog leaned against me harder, as if he knew that whatever happened next was going to change everything. I stared at the phone number on the tag for a full minute before I found the courage to dial it. My fingers were numb from the cold, and I had to try 3 times before I managed to press the right numbers. The phone rang once, twice. On the 3rd ring, a crisp, professional voice answered. "Wellington Residence, Maxwell speaking." I nearly hung up. Wellington Residence? Maxwell? This sounded like something out of a movie, not the kind of phone call a retired nurse from a 1-bedroom apartment was supposed to be making. Hello? I managed, my voice barely above a whisper. "I found a dog. He has this phone number on his collar." There was a pause, and then the voice, Maxwell, became suddenly urgent. "Ma'am, could you please describe the dog?" He's small, golden fur, very sweet. He was lost in Riverside Park, and he seemed hungry and cold. "Oh, thank goodness," Maxwell said, and I could hear genuine relief in his voice. "Ma'am, this is extremely important. Where are you right now? Are you safe? Is the dog with you?" Charlie. So that was his name. "Yes, we're both fine. We're still in the park on Elm Street, but—" "Please don't move," Maxwell interrupted. "I'm sending someone to collect you both immediately. May I have your name?" "Flora," I said automatically. "Flora Henderson. But I don't understand." "Mrs. Henderson, I cannot thank you enough for calling. You have no idea how worried we've been. Please, just stay exactly where you are. Someone will be there in less than 10 minutes. The line went dead, leaving me staring at my phone in confusion. I looked down at Charlie, who was now sitting calmly beside me as if none of this was strange at all. "What exactly have I gotten myself into, Charlie?" I asked him. He wagged his tail and licked my hand, which was somehow reassuring despite the bizarre circumstances. True to Maxwell's word, exactly 8 minutes later, a pair of headlights turned into the park. But it wasn't just any car. It was a black Mercedes sedan, the kind I'd only ever seen in movies or driving past me on the highway. It moved silently through the park entrance and came to a stop directly in front of my bench. The driver's door opened, and out stepped a man who looked like he'd walked out of a different century. He was wearing a perfectly tailored black coat, leather gloves, and what appeared to be an honest-to-goodness chauffeur's cap. He had to be in his 60s, with silver hair and the kind of posture that spoke of military training or years of formal service. "Mrs. Henderson?" he asked, approaching us with measured steps. His voice was the same one I'd heard on the phone, Maxwell. "Yes," I said, standing up slowly. Charlie remained pressed against my legs, but his tail was wagging faster now, as if he recognized either Maxwell or the car. "Ma'am," Maxwell said, and then he did something that nearly knocked me over. He bowed, actually bowed, like I was royalty instead of an old woman in a worn coat sitting in a public park. "I cannot express how grateful Mr. Wellington will be that you found Charlie and kept him safe." Mr. Wellington. The name sent a little chill down my spine, though I couldn't say why. "Is Mr. Wellington Charlie's owner?" I asked. "Indeed he is, ma'am, and he's been quite beside himself with worry." Maxwell looked down at Charlie, who had trotted over to him and was receiving gentle pats. Charlie has never wandered off before. Mr. Wellington was afraid something terrible might have happened. I watched Maxwell's face carefully. There was something in his expression, something that suggested this was about more than just a lost pet. "How did Charlie get lost?" I asked. Maxwell's expression became carefully neutral. "There was an incident earlier this evening. Charlie was startled and ran off during his walk. We've had search teams looking for him for hours." Search teams for a dog. I glanced again at the diamond hanging from Charlie's collar and began to understand that whoever Mr. Wellington was, he was not an ordinary person. Mrs. Henderson, Maxwell continued, Mr. Wellington would very much like to thank you in person if you'd be willing. He's waiting at the house. I looked at the Mercedes, then at Maxwell's expectant face, then down at Charlie, who was looking up at me with those trusting brown eyes. I don't think that's necessary, I said slowly. I'm just glad Charlie is safe. I should probably get home. Ma'am, Maxwell said, and his voice held a note I couldn't quite interpret. I think you should know that Mr. Wellington specifically asked me to tell you that he's been hoping to meet you for a very long time. My heart stopped. I'm sorry, what did you say? He's been hoping to meet you, ma'am, for a very long time. The words hung in the cold air between us. This made no sense. I'd never heard the name Wellington before tonight. I was absolutely certain I'd never met anyone who owned diamonds for their dog, or had chauffeurs who spoke like they'd stepped out of a British novel. I think there's been some mistake, I said. I've never met any Mr. Wellington. Maxwell's face softened slightly. Ma'am, with all due respect, I think you have, though it was a long time ago, and he went by a different name then. A different name. My mind started racing, trying to think of anyone I might have known who could have become wealthy enough to own cars like this and employ people like Maxwell. But I came up blank. Mrs. Henderson, Maxwell said gently. Mr. Wellington was a patient of yours at Harrison General Hospital about 15 years ago. The words hit me like a physical blow. Harrison General. I'd worked there for 12 years before budget cuts forced them to eliminate my position. I'd cared for hundreds of patients during that time, maybe thousands. I cared for a lot of patients, I said weakly. Yes, ma'am, but Mr. Wellington remembers you very clearly. He's never forgotten your kindness during what was a very difficult time in his life. I tried to think, to remember anyone who might have been named Wellington. But the truth was, after so many years and so many patients, faces and names tended to blur together, unless something extraordinary had happened. He remembers me? I asked. Oh, yes, ma'am. He's spoken of you often over the years. He's tried to find you multiple times, but you'd moved, and your old phone number was disconnected. This was becoming surreal. Someone had been looking for me. Someone I'd cared for had actually remembered me enough to try to find me years later. Ma'am, Maxwell said, glancing at his watch. It's Christmas Eve, and it's quite cold. Mr. Wellington is waiting, and I know he'd be honored if you'd allow me to drive you to meet him, even if it's just for a few minutes. I looked around the empty park, thought about my silent apartment and the can of soup waiting for me. Then I thought about Trent and Miranda, and the perfect family dinner I'd never be invited to. What did I have to lose? All right, I heard myself saying. I'll meet him. Maxwell's face broke into the first genuine smile I'd seen from him. Wonderful, ma'am, if you'll allow me. He moved to open the rear door of the Mercedes, and I got my first look at the interior. Leather seats the color of cream, wood trim that gleamed even in the dim light, and an interior that was warmer and more luxurious than my entire apartment. Charlie jumped in first, settling himself on the seat like he'd done it 1,000 times before. I slid in after him, sinking into leather so soft it felt like sitting on a cloud. Maxwell closed the door gently and returned to the driver's seat. The car started so quietly I barely heard the engine. Where are we going? I asked as we pulled out of the park. Not far, ma'am, Maxwell said, glancing at me in the rearview mirror. About 20 minutes to Lakeshore Drive. Lakeshore Drive. I knew the area. It was where the really wealthy people lived. Houses that sold for millions of dollars, with private docks and gates and security systems. Not the kind of place where people like me were usually welcome. As we drove through the increasingly upscale neighborhoods, Maxwell made polite conversation about the weather and Charlie's habits, but I could sense something beneath his professional demeanor. An excitement, maybe, or anticipation. "Maxwell," I said finally, "can you tell me what Mr. Wellington's first name is? It might help me remember him." In the rearview mirror, I saw Maxwell smile. "Of course, ma'am. His name is Dean Wellington." Dean. The name hit me like lightning, and suddenly I was back in room 412 at Harrison General 15 years ago. A man in his late 30s, paralyzed from a car accident, angry and bitter and convinced his life was over. His family had visited the first few weeks, but as it became clear he might never walk again, the visits had become less frequent, then stopped altogether. Dean Morrison. That had been his name then. Morrison, not Wellington. I remembered him now. How could I have forgotten? He'd been one of my most challenging patients, not because of his medical needs, but because of his rage. He'd yelled at nurses, thrown things, refused treatment. Everyone dreaded being assigned to his room. Everyone except me. I'd seen something in his eyes that the others missed. Not anger, but terror. The terror of a man who'd lost everything he thought made him who he was. "Oh my God," I whispered. "Dean." "Yes, ma'am," Maxwell said softly. "He's been looking for you for a very long time." My heart started beating faster as more memories came flooding back. The weeks I'd spent talking to him, listening to him rage against his fate. The day he'd finally let me read to him. The afternoon he'd cried in my arms like a child. And the day I'd been told he was being transferred to a long-term care facility because his insurance had run out. I'd never seen him again. "How is he?" I asked, my voice barely audible. Maxwell's smile in the mirror was radiant. "Ma'am, Dean Wellington is one of the most successful men in the state, but more importantly, he's one of the happiest. And he credits that entirely to a nurse named Flora Henderson, who refused to give up on him when everyone else had." The Mercedes turned into a driveway that seemed to go on forever, lined with trees that had been wrapped in thousands of tiny lights. At the end of the drive stood a house that looked like something from a fairy tale. Not ostentatious, but elegant and welcoming, with warm light spilling from every window. Charlie was sitting up now, tail wagging furiously, obviously recognizing home. "Ma'am," Maxwell said as we pulled to a stop in front of the house, "Mr. Wellington, Dean, wants you to know that finding you tonight feels like a Christmas miracle." Charlie running off and ending up in that exact park where you would be sitting at that exact moment. Well, he doesn't believe in coincidences. As Maxwell came around to open my door, I saw the front door of the house open. A figure appeared in the doorway, silhouetted against the golden light from inside. Even from a distance, even after 15 years, I knew it was Dean. And I knew my life was about to change forever. The man standing in the doorway wasn't the broken, angry patient I remembered from 15 years ago. This Dean Wellington stood tall and confident, though I could see the wheelchair parked just behind him in the foyer. He was wearing an expensive sweater and dark slacks, and his hair had gone silver at the temples in a way that made him look distinguished rather than old. But his eyes were exactly the same. The same deep blue that had blazed with fury in room 412, then later with hope when he'd finally allowed me to help him believe in a future. "Flora," he said, and my name came out like a prayer. "My God, it's really you." Maxwell was beside me, offering his arm for support, which I gratefully took because my legs had suddenly become unreliable. Charlie bounded out of the car and raced toward Dean, who reached down from his standing position to scratch behind the dog's ears. "Hello, Dean," I managed, my voice coming out in a whisper. "I can't believe that you're standing?" He smiled, that same crooked smile I remembered, though it was no longer bitter. It took 5 years of physical therapy, 3 experimental surgeries, and more determination than I knew I had. But you taught me that miracles were possible if I didn't give up. I felt tears starting to blur my vision. You were told you'd never walk again. I was told a lot of things. He stepped forward, moving slowly but steadily. The doctor said I'd never regain feeling below my waist. Insurance companies said I wasn't worth the investment in experimental treatments. My own family said I should accept my limitations and be grateful for what I had left. He stopped about 3 feet away from me, close enough that I could see the fine lines around his eyes, the evidence of years that had passed since our time at Harrison General. But there was one nurse who told me something different. She said that my body might be broken, but my spirit wasn't. And as long as my spirit was intact, anything was possible. Do you remember saying that, Flora? I did remember. It was during one of his darkest days, when he'd refused to eat or speak to anyone. I'd sat in that uncomfortable plastic chair beside his bed for 2 hours, talking to him about everything and nothing, until finally he'd looked at me and asked why I bothered with him when everyone else had given up. I remember, I whispered. That conversation changed my life, Dean said simply. Not just because of what you said, but because of how you said it, like you actually believed it, like you saw something in me that I couldn't see in myself. Maxwell cleared his throat gently. Perhaps we should move this conversation inside. It's quite cold, and Mrs. Henderson has had a long evening. Of course, Dean said, his face flushing with embarrassment. Flora, please come in. Let me make you some tea or coffee or whatever you'd like. The interior of the house was even more beautiful than the exterior. The foyer opened into a living room that managed to be both elegant and comfortable, with a fireplace crackling warmly and furniture that looked like it had been chosen for comfort rather than show. Family photos, though I noticed they seemed to be of Dean with friends and colleagues rather than blood relatives, lined the mantelpiece, and Charlie immediately settled onto what was obviously his favorite spot on a leather sofa. This is beautiful, I said, and I meant it. Despite the obvious wealth on display, there was something warm and inviting about the space. It felt like a home, not a showpiece. Thank you. I've tried to make it comfortable. After spending so many months in sterile hospital rooms, I wanted to surround myself with things that felt alive and welcoming. He gestured toward a pair of chairs near the fireplace. Please sit. Let me get you something warm to drink. As I settled into a chair that was probably worth more than my monthly pension, I watched Dean move around the kitchen area that was visible from the living room. His movements were careful but confident, and I could see the subtle ways he'd adapted his routine to accommodate his physical limitations. The counters were slightly lower than standard and everything was within easy reach. You know, I said as he prepared what smelled like expensive coffee, I've wondered about you over the years. After you were transferred, I tried to find out what happened to you, but patient privacy laws. I know, he said, carrying a tray with coffee and what looked like homemade cookies. I tried to find you too. When I was finally ready to leave that facility and start rebuilding my life, you were the first person I wanted to thank. But you'd left Harrison General, and no one could tell me where you'd gone. He settled into the chair across from me, and I noticed he moved with the practiced ease of someone who'd learned to navigate the world differently but successfully. I hired private investigators, he continued. But Flora Henderson is a common enough name, and I didn't have much to go on. I knew you lived somewhere in the metropolitan area, but that was it. You hired investigators to find me? I asked, shocked. Flora, you saved my life. Not in a medical sense. Other nurses could have administered my medications and monitored my vitals. You saved my life by refusing to let me disappear into despair. He leaned forward, his eyes intense. Do you have any idea what it meant to have someone sit with me during those panic attacks? To have someone read to me when I couldn't concentrate enough to read myself? To have someone believe I was worth fighting for when my own family had written me off? I felt my cheeks burning. I was just doing my job. No, Dean said firmly. You were doing far more than your job. I remember the night shift supervisor telling you that you didn't need to spend so much time in my room, that there were other patients who needed attention, and you told her that every patient deserved to feel like they mattered. The memory came flooding back, Supervisor Jenkins, who'd always been more concerned with efficiency than compassion, questioning my excessive time spent with difficult patients. I also remember, Dean continued, the day you brought in your own books because the hospital library didn't have anything I wanted to read. And the afternoon you stayed 3 hours past your shift because I was having that breakdown about the anniversary of my accident. I had forgotten about the books, but as soon as he mentioned it, I could see them clearly. My personal copies of adventure novels and biographies that I'd thought might interest him. You spent your own money on my care, Dean said quietly. Those books, the special pillow you bought because the hospital ones hurt my neck, the magazines you'd pick up on your way to work. You never asked to be reimbursed. They were small things, I protested. Small things that added up to the difference between giving up and holding on. Dean reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn paperback book. I still have this. The biography of Franklin Roosevelt that you gave me when I was angry about being in a wheelchair. Do you remember what you wrote in the front cover? I shook my head, but he opened the book and read in a voice thick with emotion. Dear Dean, FDR changed the world from a wheelchair. Your accident doesn't define your limits. Your courage does. With admiration and hope, Flora. My hands flew to my mouth. I had completely forgotten writing that inscription. I read that book 17 times, Dean said. And every time I wanted to quit physical therapy or give up on the experimental treatments, I read your note again. We sat in silence for a moment, the fire crackling softly in the background. Charlie had fallen asleep on his sofa, snoring gently. Dean, I said finally, what happened to your family? I remember them visiting in the beginning. His expression darkened slightly. They visited less and less as it became clear I wasn't going to make a quick recovery. My parents felt I was becoming too much of a burden, especially when it looked like I'd need long-term care. My sister was busy with her own family, my fiancé. He paused. Well, she decided that a paralyzed man wasn't what she'd signed up for. I'm so sorry. Don't be. It was the best thing that could have happened to me, though I couldn't see it at the time. It forced me to figure out who I really was when everything external was stripped away. He smiled. And it made me appreciate the people who stayed, like you. But I didn't stay, I said. I was reassigned when you were transferred. You stayed in your heart, Dean said simply. You gave me something to hold on to when I had nothing else. And when I finally got back on my feet, literally, I made myself a promise that I would find you and thank you properly. He gestured around the beautiful room. Everything I built, every success I've had, it all started with the foundation you helped me lay in that hospital room. The belief that I was worth fighting for. What did you build? I asked, curious about how the broken man I'd known had become someone who lived in a house like this. Technology, he said. After I left the rehabilitation facility, I used the settlement money from my accident to start a software company. It turns out that being forced to think differently about how to navigate the world gave me insights into creating more intuitive, accessible technology. He smiled with obvious pride. Wellington Technologies now employs over 2,000 people and develops accessibility software for major corporations. We've made technology more usable for people with disabilities, and in doing so, we've made it better for everyone. I stared at him, trying to reconcile this successful businessman with the bitter, broken patient I'd once known. But more than that, Dean continued, I've tried to pay forward what you gave me. Wellington Technologies has an employee assistance program that helps workers through medical crises. We partner with hospitals to provide funding for patients whose insurance runs out. And we have a foundation that grants scholarships to children of single mothers who are working in healthcare. The last part made my breath catch. Children of single mothers in healthcare? Like the children of nurses who work extra shifts and sacrifice their own comfort to take care of other people's families. His eyes found mine and held them. I know you raised a son on your own, Flora. I know you worked double shifts to make ends meet. I know you gave everything you had to take care of everyone else. My vision blurred with tears. How do you know that? Because I hired investigators to find you, remember? I learned about your life, your sacrifices, your dedication to your patients, even when it meant personal hardship. His voice grew soft. I learned that you'd never married again after your husband died, that you'd worked 3 jobs while putting yourself through nursing school, that you'd never missed a day of work even when you were sick because you couldn't afford to lose the pay. I felt exposed, vulnerable, like he could see right through to all the struggles I'd tried so hard to keep hidden. I also learned, Dean said gently, that you'd been forced into early retirement when Harrison General downsized, and that you've been living on a pension that barely covers your expenses. The shame hit me like a physical blow. Here I was, sitting in this beautiful house with a man who'd built an empire, and he knew exactly how small and insignificant my life had become. Flora, Dean said, and his voice made me look up. I didn't have you investigated to judge you. I had you investigated because I wanted to help you the way you helped me. I've been waiting 15 years for the chance to give back what you gave me. I don't understand. Dean smiled, and it was the same smile I remembered from the day he'd first walked with his physical therapist. Pure joy mixed with determination. Flora Henderson, I would like to offer you a job. I stared at Dean in complete shock. A job? Not just any job, he said, leaning forward with excitement. Director of Patient Advocacy for the Wellington Foundation. You'd be in charge of our hospital partnership program, making sure that patients who can't afford long-term care don't fall through the cracks the way I almost did. My mouth opened and closed without any sound coming out. Director of Patient Advocacy. The title alone sounded more important than anything I'd ever dreamed of. Dean, I don't understand. I'm 68 years old. I've been retired for 6 years. I'm not qualified for something like that. Flora, Dean said, his voice gentle but firm. You're the most qualified person I know. You have 40 years of nursing experience. You understand the healthcare system from the ground up, and most importantly, you have the heart for it. You see people as human beings, not as medical conditions or insurance claims. I shook my head, overwhelmed. But I don't have a college degree in administration or business or— I don't care about degrees, Dean interrupted. I care about character. I care about someone who will fight for patients the way you fought for me. He paused, studying my face. The salary would be $8,500 per month, plus full health benefits, plus a housing allowance. $8,500 per month, more than 4 times my current pension, more money than I'd ever made in my life, even when I was working full-time. That's too much, I said automatically. I couldn't possibly be worth that much. Dean's expression grew serious. Flora, let me tell you something about worth. Do you remember the night I tried to refuse my pain medication because I said I deserved to hurt? I remembered. It had been about 6 weeks into his stay, during one of his darkest periods. He'd been convinced that the accident was punishment for some unnamed sin, and he'd decided he didn't deserve relief from his suffering. You sat beside my bed for 4 hours that night, Dean continued. You didn't lecture me about being foolish or try to force the medication on me. You just talked to me about pain, physical pain and emotional pain, and how healing from both required courage, not punishment. The memory was clearer now. I'd shared stories about other patients I'd seen overcome tremendous obstacles, and I'd told him about my own grief after my husband died, how I'd had to choose between drowning in it or finding a way to honor his memory by living fully. By the end of that night, I took the medication. But more than that, I started to believe that maybe I deserved to get better. That maybe my life still had value even if it looked different than I'd planned. Dean stood up and walked to the mantelpiece, picking up a framed photograph. He brought it back and handed it to me. It showed a much younger Dean in a hospital bed, thin and pale but smiling. Beside the bed stood a woman in nursing scrubs, me, though I barely recognized myself. My physical therapist took that picture, Dean said. It was the first time I'd smiled since the accident. You'd just finished reading me that chapter from the Roosevelt biography, where he talks about fear being the only thing we have to fear. I stared at the photograph, remembering that day. Dean had been making real progress in physical therapy, but he'd been terrified that it wouldn't last, that he'd plateau and never improve further. I keep that picture on my mantle because it reminds me of the moment my real recovery began, Dean said. Not the physical recovery. That was important, but this was bigger. It was the recovery of hope. I set the photo down carefully, my hands shaking slightly. Dean, you would have found that hope anyway. You're strong. No, he said firmly. I was broken, Flora, completely broken. Not just physically, but emotionally and spiritually. I was ready to give up. I'd already told my doctors that I didn't want any more experimental treatments. This was news to me. During our time together, Dean had been cooperative with his medical team, even when he was frustrated or angry. You changed that, Dean continued, not with big speeches or dramatic gestures, but with small acts of kindness that added up to something life-changing. Do you remember bringing me that puzzle? I did remember. It had been a 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzle of a lighthouse on a rocky coast. Dean had complained that the hospital was boring, that he felt like his mind was turning to mush from lack of stimulation. I worked on that puzzle every day for 3 months, Dean said. It gave me something to focus on besides my limitations. But more than that, you checked on my progress every shift. You celebrated with me when I found difficult pieces, and you encouraged me when I got frustrated and wanted to quit. He smiled at the memory. The day I placed the final piece, you brought me a cupcake from the hospital cafeteria. You said every accomplishment deserved recognition, no matter how small it seemed to other people. I had brought him that cupcake. It had cost me $3.75, which I could barely afford at the time, but his excitement about finishing the puzzle had been so infectious. That puzzle taught me something crucial, Dean said. It taught me that recovery wasn't about getting back to who I used to be. It was about building something new, piece by piece, with patience and persistence. He walked back to his chair and sat down, his eyes never leaving my face. Flora, you gave me the tools I needed to rebuild my life. The salary I'm offering isn't charity, it's an investment. I want you to help other people the way you helped me. I felt tears starting again. But what if I'm not good at it? What if I fail? Then you'll learn and try again, the same way I did with physical therapy. Dean's voice was warm but determined. Flora, I didn't become successful by playing it safe. I became successful by taking chances on the right people, and you're the rightest person I know. I looked around the beautiful room, trying to process everything he was telling me. Where would I work? I don't even have a car that could get me to an office downtown. The foundation has offices here in the house, Dean said, and Maxwell would be happy to drive you wherever you need to go. But honestly, a lot of the work could be done from home if you preferred. My mind was reeling. This morning, I'd been a lonely retiree with $37 in my checking account, and now I was being offered a job that would change my entire life. There's something else, Dean said quietly. The foundation owns a small house about 2 miles from here. 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, a garden. It's meant for visiting researchers or guest speakers, but it's been empty for months. You could live there rent-free as part of your compensation package. A house. He was offering me a house. Dean, this is too much. You don't owe me anything. I was just doing my job. Stop, he said gently but firmly. Stop diminishing what you did. You didn't just do your job, Flora. You went above and beyond in every possible way. You spent your own money, your own time, your own emotional energy to help a stranger get through the worst period of his life. He reached into an end-table drawer and pulled out a thick folder. Do you want to know what else my investigators found out about you? I wasn't sure I did, but I nodded. They found out that you worked extra shifts for 3 years to help pay for your son's college tuition, even though he barely spoke to you. They found out that you've sent your grandson birthday cards for 5 years, even though they're always returned unopened. They found out that you volunteered at a free clinic every Saturday for 8 years until your arthritis made it too difficult. Each revelation felt like a punch to my chest. These were private things, personal struggles that I'd never shared with anyone. They also found out, Dean said, his voice growing softer, that you spent last Christmas alone because your son said there wasn't room for you at his family dinner. I looked up sharply. How could you possibly know that? Because I hired investigators who are very good at their jobs. Dean's expression was gentle but sad. Flora, you've spent your entire adult life taking care of other people, and no one has taken care of you. That ends now. I felt a sob building in my chest. Dean, you don't understand. My relationship with my son is complicated. I wasn't always there for him when he was growing up because I was working so much. Maybe I deserve. You deserve nothing but love and respect, Dean said firmly. You worked multiple jobs to provide for your child. You sacrificed your own comfort to give him opportunities. The fact that he can't appreciate that says nothing about you and everything about him. The sob escaped despite my best efforts to contain it. All the years of guilt, all the self-doubt about whether I'd been a good enough mother, came pouring out. Dean moved to the sofa and patted the cushion beside him. Come here, he said gently. I moved to sit beside him, and he handed me a box of tissues from the coffee table. Flora, he said, I want to tell you something that might be hard to hear. Your son doesn't appreciate you not because you failed as a mother, but because he's never had to face real hardship. You worked so hard to give him stability that he never learned to value sacrifice. I wiped my eyes with a tissue. He's not a bad person. He just takes you for granted, Dean finished. And that's not acceptable. You raised him. You supported him. You loved him unconditionally. The fact that he can't make room for you at Christmas dinner is a reflection of his character, not yours. We sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, Charlie's gentle snoring the only sound in the room. Outside, snow had begun to fall again, but inside, by the fire, I felt warmer than I had in years. Flora, Dean said finally, I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I want you to answer honestly. Are you happy with your current life? I thought about my small apartment, my empty days, the phone that rarely rang except for telemarketers. I thought about spending holidays alone, about having to choose between groceries and prescription medications, about feeling invisible and unnecessary. No, I whispered. I'm not happy. Then let me help you change that, Dean said. Take the job, move into the house. Let me give you the chance to feel valued and important again. I looked at him, this man I'd known as broken and bitter, now successful and kind, offering me a lifeline I'd never dared to hope for. What if your investigators were wrong about me? I asked. What if I'm not as good a person as you think I am? Dean smiled. Flora, do you know how I knew it was you who found Charlie tonight? I shook my head. Because only someone with your heart would sit in a freezing park on Christmas Eve and give their last sandwich to a stray dog. Charlie didn't wander off by accident. I let him go, hoping he'd lead me to someone who would help him. I've been doing it for months, looking for you. My mouth fell open. You've been using Charlie to find me? I knew you lived somewhere in this area, and I knew that if our paths crossed, you'd be the kind of person who would help a lost animal. Dean's eyes twinkled with mischief. I just didn't expect him to find you on Christmas Eve. That really was a miracle. I stared at him in amazement. You're telling me this whole thing was a setup? Not a setup, a hope. A hope that the woman who saved my life 15 years ago would still be the kind of person who would save a stranger's dog on the coldest night of the year. He reached over and took my hand, and I was right. For the first time in years, I felt something I'd almost forgotten, the feeling of being truly wanted, truly valued, truly seen. Yes, I said, my voice stronger than it had been all evening. Yes, I'll take the job. Dean's face broke into a grin that could have powered the whole house. Welcome to the Wellington Foundation, Director Henderson. The next morning, I woke up in what Dean called the guest suite, a bedroom larger than my entire apartment, with windows that looked out over a garden dusted with fresh snow. For a moment, I forgot where I was, and then the events of Christmas Eve came flooding back. The job offer, the house, the chance to start over at 68 years old. It all seemed too good to be true in the harsh light of morning. A soft knock at the door interrupted my thoughts. Mrs. Henderson? Maxwell's voice was gentle. Mr. Wellington asked me to let you know that breakfast is ready whenever you'd like to join him. I'd slept in my clothes from the night before, and I felt rumpled and out of place. Thank you, Maxwell. I'll be right down. When I made my way to the kitchen, I found Dean at the stove, expertly flipping pancakes with one hand while steadying himself with the other. Charlie was sitting hopefully nearby, clearly expecting scraps. Good morning, Dean said with a warm smile. I hope you slept well. Better than I have in months, I admitted. The bed had been like sleeping on a cloud, and for the first time in years, I hadn't woken up worrying about money. Excellent. I made my famous blueberry pancakes. Well, I say famous, but really only Charlie and Maxwell have ever tasted them. He gestured toward a place setting at the kitchen island. Coffee's fresh, and there's orange juice if you prefer. As I settled onto the bar stool, I watched Dean move around his adapted kitchen with easy confidence. Everything was positioned for someone who needed to maintain balance while cooking, but it didn't look medical or institutional. It just looked thoughtfully designed. Dean, I said as he placed a stack of perfect golden pancakes in front of me. I want you to know that last night meant everything to me. But I've been thinking, and I'm not sure I'm the right person for this job. He paused, syrup bottle halfway to his own plate. What makes you say that? I don't have any experience with foundations or administration. I've never managed anything bigger than a nursing shift. What if I disappoint you? Dean set down the syrup and looked at me seriously. Flora, can I tell you about my first day as CEO of Wellington Technologies? I nodded, cutting into the pancakes, which smelled incredible. I had no idea what I was doing. None. I'd started the company from my rehabilitation facility bed, but I'd been so focused on the technical side that I'd never thought about actually running a business. He laughed, shaking his head. My first board meeting was a disaster. I forgot half the agenda, mispronounced our biggest client's name, and accidentally revealed confidential information that nearly cost us a contract. What happened? My board wanted to replace me with someone more experienced, but my mentor, an older gentleman named Frank Morrison who'd invested in the company, took me aside afterward. Dean's expression grew thoughtful. He said, Son, competence can be taught, character cannot. I didn't invest in your experience. I invested in who you are. He reached across the counter and touched my hand gently. Flora, I'm not hiring your resume. I'm hiring your heart. Everything else can be learned. Despite his reassurance, anxiety gnawed at me. But what if your board of directors feels differently? What if they think you're making a mistake hiring someone like me? Then they'll learn that I don't make mistakes when it comes to people. Dean's voice was calm but firm. Besides, I am the board of directors. The foundation is my baby, funded entirely by Wellington Technologies' profits. I answer to no one but my own conscience. After breakfast, Dean gave me a tour of the foundation offices, which occupied the entire east wing of his house. The setup was impressive, but not intimidating. Comfortable chairs, warm lighting, and walls covered with thank you letters from families the foundation had helped. This will be your office, Dean said, opening the door to a corner room with windows on two sides. If you want to change anything about the decor, just let Maxwell know. I walked to the window and looked out at the snow-covered garden. It's beautiful. But Dean, are you sure about the salary? $8,500 a month seems like so much for someone who doesn't even know what she's doing yet. Flora, last year Wellington Technologies generated $450 million in revenue. The foundation's budget is $12 million annually. Your salary represents less than 1% of our charitable giving. He joined me at the window. You're not expensive. You're an investment. That afternoon, Maxwell drove me to my apartment to pack my belongings. The contrast between my tiny, shabby home and Dean's elegant house was jarring, and I felt embarrassed for Maxwell to see how little I had. "Mrs. Henderson," Maxwell said as we climbed the narrow stairs to my second-floor apartment. "Might I say how pleased Mr. Wellington was to find you last night? In all the years I've worked for him, I've never seen him so happy." "You've worked for him long?" 12 years, Maxwell said. "Since shortly after he started the company. He's been like a son to me, really. My own children live across the country, and when my wife passed 5 years ago." He paused, clearing his throat. Well, Mr. Wellington made sure I wasn't alone. I unlocked my apartment door and stepped inside, seeing the space through Maxwell's eyes. The furniture was old but clean, the walls needed painting, and everything spoke of careful economy rather than choice. "He's lucky to have you," I said, beginning to gather my few precious items, photo albums, my mother's china, the small collection of books I'd held onto through various moves. "Ma'am, if I may," Maxwell said, watching me pack. "Mr. Wellington has spoken of you often over the years. You're something of a legend in our house." I looked up, surprised. "What do you mean?" "He tells the story of your kindness to every new employee at Wellington Technologies, about how you saw potential in him when no one else did, how you treated him like a person worth fighting for." Maxwell's voice grew soft. "He says you taught him that true wealth isn't measured in money, but in how much good you can do for others." I felt my throat tighten. "I just treated him the way everyone deserves to be treated." "Exactly," Maxwell said. "And that, ma'am, is why you're exactly the right person for this job." It took us less than 2 hours to pack everything I owned into the back of Dean's Mercedes. As Maxwell loaded the last box, I took one final look around the apartment that had been my home for 6 years. When I gave my keys to the landlord and told him I wouldn't be renewing my lease, his only response was to grunt and make a note in his ledger. No goodbye, no acknowledgement of the years I'd lived there without ever missing a rent payment. The house Dean had offered me was everything he'd promised and more. Built in the 1920s, it had hardwood floors, built-in bookshelves, and a kitchen with windows that looked out over a small but well-maintained garden. There was even a reading nook with a window seat where I could imagine spending quiet afternoons. "The foundation pays for utilities and maintenance," Dean explained as he showed me around. "All you need to worry about is making it feel like home." That evening, as I unpacked my meager belongings in my new spacious bedroom, my phone rang. The caller ID showed Trent's number, and for a moment I considered not answering. But old habits die hard. "Hello, Trent?" "Mom? I just drove by your apartment and there's a for rent sign in the window. Where are you?" His voice carried a note of panic that I hadn't heard since he was a child. I realized he must have come by to deliver whatever token gesture of Christmas cheer he'd felt obligated to provide. "I moved," I said simply. "Moved? Where? Why didn't you tell me?" I looked around my beautiful new bedroom, with its view of snow-covered trees and its sense of peace and security. "I didn't think you'd be interested." "Of course I'm interested. You're my mother. Where are you living? Do you need help with the rent?" The irony of his sudden concern would have been amusing if it weren't so painful. 24 hours ago, I'd been alone and unwanted. Now that I was no longer available to be taken for granted, I'd suddenly become worthy of his attention. "I don't need help, Trent. I'm fine." "But Mom, you can't afford to live anywhere decent on your pension. What kind of place were you able to rent?" Through the phone, I could hear Miranda's voice in the background, sharp with curiosity. I could picture them in their perfect house, suddenly realizing they'd lost track of their reliable backup plan, the mother who could always be counted on to be available when needed. Actually, Trent, I got a job. A very good job. And the position comes with housing. A job? Mom, you're 68 years old. What kind of job? Director of Patient Advocacy for the Wellington Foundation. The silence that followed was so complete, I wondered if the call had been dropped. Mom, Trent said finally, his voice careful. That sounds like a big title. Are you sure this is legitimate? There are a lot of scams targeting seniors. I felt a familiar flash of anger. Even now, even when I was telling him about the most wonderful thing that had happened to me in years, his first instinct was to doubt me. It's legitimate, Trent. The foundation is run by someone I used to care for when I was a nurse. He remembered me and offered me the position. Well, how much does it pay? Because if this person is taking advantage of you, I almost told him, almost shared the incredible salary that would change everything about my life. But something stopped me. Maybe the memory of Christmas Eve, sitting alone in that park while he enjoyed his perfect family dinner. It pays enough, I said instead. More than enough. Mom, I think you should be careful. This sounds too good to be true. Maybe you should come stay with us while you think this through. The offer was too little. Too late. If he'd made it 24 hours earlier, I might have been pathetically grateful. Now it just sounded hollow. Thank you. But I'm very happy where I am. In fact, I need to go. I start work tomorrow, and I want to be well rested. But Mom? Goodbye, Trent. Give my love to Miranda and Tommy. I hung up before he could respond, then immediately turned off my phone. Through my bedroom window, I could see lights glowing warmly in Dean's house across the garden. I thought about the man who had remembered a kindness from 15 years ago, who had spent months looking for me, who had offered me not just a job, but a chance to matter again. For the first time in years, I fell asleep excited about tomorrow. 6 months later, I stood in my office at the Wellington Foundation, reviewing applications for our newest program, Emergency Medical Assistance for Families Facing Unexpected Health Crises. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was now the person making decisions about who deserved help, who was worth investing in. The work was everything Dean had promised it would be: challenging, meaningful, and deeply rewarding. In my first month alone, we'd helped 12 families avoid bankruptcy due to medical bills, funded experimental treatments for 3 patients whose insurance had given up on them, and established partnerships with 4 regional hospitals to ensure no patient would be discharged without adequate support. I'd also discovered I had a talent for administration that surprised everyone, including myself. Years of managing complex patient care schedules had apparently prepared me well for coordinating foundation programs. My nursing background gave me credibility with medical professionals, and my personal experience with financial struggle helped me identify truly worthy cases. But the best part was working with Dean every day. He'd become not just my employer, but my closest friend. We shared morning coffee and discussed foundation business, but we also talked about books, current events, and memories of our respective pasts. He was brilliant and kind, and I treasured our growing friendship. The door to my office opened, and Maxwell appeared with his usual perfect timing. Mrs. Henderson, your 11 o'clock appointment is here. I glanced at my schedule. The Harrison General Hospital consultation? Yes, ma'am. The administrator wants to discuss expanding our partnership program. I smiled, gathering the files I'd need for the meeting. Harrison General, my old hospital, where I'd first met Dean all those years ago. It felt like completing a circle. As Maxwell ushered in the hospital administrator, a professional woman about 45 with tired eyes that I recognized from my own nursing days, I stood to greet her. Mrs. Henderson, I'm Sarah Martinez, Director of Patient Services at Harrison General. Thank you so much for agreeing to meet with me. We settled into the comfortable chairs by the window, and Sarah pulled out a thick folder of documents. I have to say, when we first heard about the Wellington Foundation's hospital partnership program, it sounded almost too good to be true, but after seeing the results at other facilities, she shook her head in amazement. The difference you've made is incredible. Over the past 6 months, the foundation had placed patient advocates in 8 regional hospitals. These advocates, many of them retired nurses like myself, worked directly with families to navigate insurance complications, find resources for continued care, and ensure that no patient fell through the cracks due to bureaucratic complications. The program has been very successful, I agreed. But it only works when hospital administration is fully committed to the partnership. Oh, we're committed, Sarah said quickly. We've seen too many families destroyed by medical debt, too many patients given up on because their insurance ran out. What you're offering, it's exactly what healthcare should be. We spent the next hour discussing implementation details, staffing requirements, and budget considerations. It was the kind of complex negotiation that would have terrified me 6 months ago, but now felt natural and energizing. As Sarah was leaving, she paused at the door. Mrs. Henderson, can I ask you something personal? I nodded. Were you ever a patient care nurse at Harrison General? Your name sounds familiar, and something about your approach to patient advocacy. I was, I said. I worked there for 12 years before the downsizing in 2018. Sarah's face lit up with recognition. I thought so. I was a new administrator then, and I remember hearing about a nurse who went above and beyond for her patients. The other staff talked about you all the time, how you'd stay late with difficult cases, how you never gave up on anyone. A warm feeling spread through my chest. After all these years, I was remembered not for my limitations or my struggles, but for my dedication. That's very kind of you to say. It's not kind, it's true. And now I understand why the Wellington Foundation is so effective. You're bringing that same heart to healthcare administration that you brought to bedside care. After Sarah left, I sat quietly in my office, looking out at the garden where snow was beginning to fall again. In a few hours, Dean and I would have our weekly dinner together, a tradition we'd started after my first week on the job. Tonight we were planning the Foundation's first annual gala, a fundraising event that would allow us to expand our programs even further. My phone buzzed with a text message. I glanced at it, expecting something work-related, but instead saw Trent's name. Mom, Miranda, and I were wondering if you'd like to come to dinner this weekend. Tommy's been asking about his grandmother. I stared at the message for a long time. Over the past 6 months, Trent had called regularly, his tone gradually shifting from concern to curiosity to something that might have been respect. He'd learned that my job was real, that my new living situation was legitimate, and that I was no longer the financially struggling woman he'd grown accustomed to dismissing. Miranda had even called once, supposedly to catch up, though I suspected she was fishing for information about exactly how well the foundation paid its directors. The truth was, I could afford to be generous now. I could afford to overlook their past treatment of me, to focus on building a better relationship going forward. Dean had taught me that holding on to resentment only poisoned the person carrying it, but I'd also learned something else over the past 6 months. I no longer needed their approval to feel valuable. Their acceptance, while pleasant, wasn't essential to my happiness. I typed back a careful response. That sounds lovely. Let me check my schedule and get back to you. It wasn't a no, but it also wasn't the eager, grateful yes I would have given 6 months ago. I had learned to value my own time and energy, to make decisions based on what I wanted rather than what other people expected of me. A knock at my office door interrupted my thoughts. Dean appeared, leaning against the doorframe with Charlie at his side. How did the Harrison General meeting go? Very well. They're enthusiastic about the partnership. I gestured to the chair across from my desk. Sarah Martinez remembered me from when I worked there. She said the staff used to talk about my patient care. Dean's face broke into a proud smile. Of course they did. You were probably the best nurse they ever had. I don't know about that. I do. Dean settled into the chair, and Charlie immediately went to his favorite spot under the window. Flora, there's something I've been wanting to discuss with you. His tone was more serious than usual, and I felt a flutter of anxiety. What is it? The foundation has grown faster than I ever imagined it would. In 6 months, we've expanded from a small local charity to a regional organization with real impact. He leaned forward, his expression earnest. But to take the next step, to become a truly national foundation, we need to restructure. My heart sank. Was he letting me go? Had I somehow failed to meet his expectations? I want to promote you to executive director, Dean continued, with full authority over all foundation operations. You'd be my partner in this, Flora, not my employee. I stared at him in shock. Dean, I couldn't possibly. Yes, you could. You've proven yourself over and over again. You understand the work better than anyone. You have the trust of our hospital partners. And most importantly, you care about our mission as much as I do. But the board of directors will do whatever I recommend, because I own the foundation. Dean's smile was mischievous. Besides, I've been thinking about stepping back from day-to-day operations. I'd like to travel, maybe write a book about overcoming adversity. But I can only do that if I know the foundation is in the hands of someone who shares my values. The magnitude of what he was offering hit me like a wave. Executive director of a national foundation. The chance to help thousands of families instead of dozens. The opportunity to transform healthcare advocacy on a scale I'd never imagined. The salary would be $12,000 per month, Dean added casually, plus benefits and a car allowance. Oh, and the foundation would buy the house you're living in and deed it to you outright. $12,000 per month. The house would be mine. At 68, I was being offered financial security beyond my wildest dreams, along with work that gave my life profound meaning. Dean, I said, my voice thick with emotion, why are you doing this? You've already given me so much. He was quiet for a moment, looking out at the garden where snow continued to fall softly. Because 15 years ago, a nurse sat beside my hospital bed and convinced me that my life still had value. She saw something in me that I couldn't see in myself, and she refused to give up on me. He turned back to me, his eyes bright with unshed tears. Now I see something in you that maybe you can't see in yourself yet. You're not just someone who helps people, Flora. You're someone who changes lives. And I think it's time the world benefited from that gift on a much larger scale. I thought about the scared, broken man I'd met in room 412 and the confident, successful leader he'd become. I thought about my own journey from dismissed retiree to valued professional. Most of all, I thought about all the patients and families who might benefit from the foundation's expanded reach. Yes, I said, my voice stronger than it had been in years. Yes, I'll take the position. Dean's face lit up with pure joy. Welcome to your new life, Executive Director Henderson. As the sun set over the snowy garden, I realized that my real life was just beginning. At 68, I had found not just a job, but a purpose. Not just security, but joy. Not just a place to live, but a home where I was valued for who I was rather than what I could provide. Charlie stretched and yawned from his spot by the window, then padded over to rest his head on my lap. I stroked his silky ears, thinking about the chain of events that had brought us all together. A lost dog, a diamond collar, and an act of simple kindness on a cold Christmas Eve. Sometimes miracles came disguised as ordinary moments, and sometimes the family that mattered most wasn't the one you were born into, but the one you chose. Dean was right. I had learned something about true wealth. It wasn't measured in bank accounts or real estate or job titles. It was measured in the depth of connections you made, the good you did in the world, and the love you both gave and received. For the first time in my adult life, I was truly, completely, perfectly rich. And it had all started with feeding a sandwich to a stranger's dog, because sometimes the smallest acts of kindness create the biggest miracles of all. Now I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below. And meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.